The courtyard was unnervingly silent. No market chatter, no smith's hammer, no training drills from the garrison, just the deep, creaking groan of timber under strain. In the center stood a thing that looked part siege engine, part nightmare, a crossbow the size of a ship's mast, its arms stretching wider than two men standing shoulder to shoulder. The bowstring was thick as a rope, braided from sinew and hemp, glistening faintly in the afternoon sun. On its bed rested a single massive bolt, its iron head broad and cruel, designed not for hunting deer or piercing armor, but for breaking the bones of cities. Around it, soldiers, engineers, and curious townsfolk had gathered in a wary ring. They spoke in low voices, glancing often at the weapon as if afraid it might discharge on its own. A dozen oxen had been used just to drag the device into position. Now the engineers fussed over its winding mechanism, turning great wooden cranks as the bow's limbs bent slowly, each click and groan a reminder of the tension building within. This was not the first great weapon of war the world had seen, far from it. By the late 15th century, Europe was in the midst of an arms race as intense as any modern era. Kingdoms rose and fell on the strength of their siege engines, and the ability to breach a wall in hours instead of weeks could decide whether a city became the jewel of an empire or a smoldering ruin. Cannons were growing stronger, but they were expensive, prone to misfires, and often shattered after a few dozen shots. In their shadow, mechanical weapons still had a place, and the giant crossbow was the boldest attempt to reclaim that place. This particular model had been commissioned by a wealthy and ambitious city-state, eager to show its rivals that it possessed not only gold and culture, but also the means to obliterate any fortress that dared oppose it. The mastermind behind the project was an engineer whose name was whispered in courts and workshops alike, a man with a reputation for designs as ingenious as they were dangerous. He had studied the great torsion catapults of the Romans, the ballistae that could hurl spears the length of a battlefield, and the medieval springalds that had once defended castle gates. But this was different. This was meant to shoot through stone, to send a projectile deep enough into a wall that the masonry itself would crack and crumble. It was more than a weapon, it was a statement. To the ruling council it said, "We are untouchable." To rival states it said, "We can reach you." And to the soldiers who would operate it, it whispered both reassurance and dread, reassurance that they wielded a marvel of engineering, dread at the thought of what would happen if it failed under the eyes of their leaders. On this day, the city's leaders had gathered to witness its first public demonstration. Richly dressed nobles stood alongside grizzled captains of war, all squinting toward the far end of the courtyard where a section of old fortress wall had been erected as a target. The wall itself was no mere showpiece, it had been built with the same mortar and stone as the city's own defenses, meant to prove that if the machine could destroy it here, it could destroy it anywhere. The crowd hushed as the chief engineer stepped forward. His hands were stained with oil and chalk dust, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights spent fine-tuning the beast before them. With a measured voice, he explained the mechanics, the draw strength of the bow, the weight of the projectile, the calculated velocity upon release. His words were dry to some ears, but to the military minds present they were the language of victory. Behind him, the crew prepared to fire. The crank handles spun faster now, the bowstring pulled to its final position. The great iron-tipped bolt was locked into place with a satisfying clunk. One man adjusted the elevation using a levered arm, another sighted along the weapon's length, his eyes narrowing against the glare. The silence deepened. Even the pigeons that usually fluttered about the courtyard had taken flight, as if sensing what was about to happen. A final command rang out. The release lever was pulled. With a thunderous twang, the giant bow unleashed its fury. The projectile blurred through the air, a streak of iron and ash-colored wood. In less than a heartbeat, it slammed into the target wall. Stone dust erupted in a violent cloud, and when it cleared, the crowd gasped. The bolt's head had vanished deep into the masonry, leaving a splintered crater where it struck. Cracks spiderwebbed outward several feet in every direction. The rulers exchanged glances, some triumphant, others calculating. Soldiers muttered in awe. But the engineer's face betrayed no smile. He was already thinking of improvements, of the weaknesses that would reveal themselves under the stress of battle. He knew what few in the crowd understood: the true test would not be here in the safety of the courtyard, but on the field, under enemy fire, with lives and reputations hanging in the balance. And so, even as the audience erupted in murmurs of approval, the stage was set for a far greater drama, one in which the monster in the courtyard would be called upon not just to impress, but to decide the fate of cities. Long before the giant crossbow stood in the courtyard, its idea had lived in the margins of dusty manuscripts and the minds of restless engineers. The late 15th century was an age intoxicated with invention. Europe was emerging from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, and in the hands of certain rulers, engineering became a weapon of prestige as much as destruction. The inspiration for such a machine reached back centuries. The ancient Greeks had built the gastrophetes, a shoulder-fired belly bow that hinted at mechanical amplification. The Romans had perfected the ballista, using twisted skeins of sinew to launch bolts with lethal precision over fortress walls. In the centuries after Rome's fall, Europe's engineers developed the springald, a large, crossbow-like machine hidden inside towers able to fire at enemies at close range. Each design carried the same principle: store tremendous potential energy, release it in an instant, and hurl a missile with unstoppable force. But by the Renaissance, warfare was shifting. Gunpowder artillery was reshaping sieges, yet cannons were expensive, temperamental, and as likely to kill their operators as their enemies. For many city-states, particularly in Italy, where wars were fought as often for pride as for land, a reliable, awe-inspiring siege engine still had enormous appeal. The giant crossbow emerged from this climate, a marriage of medieval mechanics and Renaissance ambition. Rulers wanted weapons that could be paraded through streets, that could terrify an enemy before a single shot was fired. A massive crossbow, unlike a cannon, could be understood at a glance. Every sinew of its frame spoke of stored violence, every iron bolt a promise of ruin. One such ruler, whose wealth was matched only by his desire to outshine his rivals, summoned the finest military engineers to his court. Among them was a man who had studied the works of both the ancients and his contemporaries, and who saw in the marriage of steel and wood a way to create a weapon that could outmatch early artillery in both power and accuracy. He pored over sketches of torsion engines, experimented with composite bow arms reinforced with steel, and calculated the ideal proportions to maximize both range and penetration. Renaissance engineering was as much art as science. Every curve of the bow arm, every tooth of the winding gear, was crafted not only for function but for beauty. The massive bolts were fitted with heads forged by master smiths, their weight carefully balanced to maintain accuracy over hundreds of meters. The wooden frame was reinforced with iron plates to resist the stresses of firing, stresses so great that even the smallest flaw could cause the weapon to shatter. But the project was more than an engineering exercise, it was a political gamble. The ruling council poured gold into its construction, knowing that failure would be a public humiliation. In rival courts, whispers spread: why build such a relic when cannons rule the battlefield? Supporters countered that the giant crossbow could fire faster than heavy artillery, required less gunpowder, and could be maintained by skilled craftsmen already in the city's employ. The weapon was also a symbol. In a time when art, architecture, and arms all served as expressions of state power, this siege engine would stand alongside marble palaces and frescoed chapels as proof of the city's sophistication and its readiness for war. When the final assembly began, crowds gathered to watch. They saw artisans fit the steel bow arms into their sockets, carpenters shape the massive stock, and laborers haul the winding gear into place. Every step was performed under the watchful eyes of the council and the nervous gaze of the engineer, who knew that in this weapon's performance lay his fortune, or his ruin. And so, the monster in the courtyard was born, not in the heat of battle, but in the cool precision of the workshop, in the mingling of ambition, fear, and pride. Its first test would not simply be of wood and steel, but of an idea, that in an age of roaring cannons, there was still a place for the silent, coiled violence of the giant crossbow. The day of the weapon's first true trial was neither marked by fanfare nor public gathering. Unlike the courtyard demonstration meant to dazzle, this was a closed affair, a proving ground just beyond the city walls, where the giant crossbow would face its first real challenge against fortified stone. The crew assembled at dawn. They were hand-picked veterans of siege operations, craftsmen who knew the feel of tension in timber, and apprentices eager to witness what had until now been only the subject of rumor. The air smelled of damp earth and oil-soaked rope. Above them, the massive bow arms stood like the antlers of some primeval beast waiting to be unleashed. The target was no hastily built wall this time. It was a section of old bastion, abandoned when the city expanded, constructed of the same thick limestone blocks as the defenses the weapon was meant to conquer. Moss clung to its crevices, but its integrity was sound, the perfect opponent. The engineers began the loading process, each motion practiced and deliberate. The winding gear groaned as the bowstring was drawn back inch by inch, the creak of timber blending with the rhythmic clank of ratchets. It took the strength of several men to reach full draw, and once there, the weapon seemed almost to hum, as though alive with restrained violence. The projectile for this test was a newly forged bolt, its iron head flared for maximum impact. Weighing nearly as much as a grown man's sword, it gleamed faintly in the morning light. It was slid into place along the grooved stock, guided by calloused hands that handled it as carefully as a surgeon's scalpel. At the command, the release lever was pulled. The sound was unlike the sharp crack of a cannon. It was deeper, a heavy thwum, followed by the hiss of the bolt slicing through air. The impact came a heartbeat later, a dull, crushing thud as stone dust erupted from the wall. A crater marked the strike, cracks fanning outward like lightning frozen in rock. Murmurs rippled through the crew. But the engineer's brow furrowed. The penetration was impressive, yet not complete. The bolt had not passed fully through, as the weapon's concept promised. He ordered a second shot. This time the elevation was adjusted, the firing angle steeper, to strike at the wall's weakest joint. Again the weapon sang its low, violent note. Again stone split, but not enough to bring the section down. Then came the other concerns. The reload time was long, even with a trained crew. The winding gear strained under repeated draws, the bowstring beginning to fray at one edge. Questions were raised about aiming in windy conditions, about moving the weapon over rough terrain. Still, there was no denying its power. The giant crossbow could cripple towers, batter gates, and sow fear before the first ladder touched the wall. Whether it could do so under enemy fire remained unanswered. That answer would only come when the weapon was called to war, when its bolts flew not in practice, but in anger. The call to war came sooner than anyone expected. A rival state, emboldened by a new alliance, had laid siege to one of the city's border fortresses, a crucial stronghold guarding the trade road. For the ruling council, this was the perfect chance to silence the doubters. The giant crossbow would not be tested on abandoned walls this time. It would face an enemy fortress under the unforgiving eye of war. The weapon was transported in pieces, each section lashed to heavy carts drawn by oxen. The march was slow and perilous. Mud-slick roads threatened to tip the great bow arms, and soldiers worked in shifts to keep the components safe. The journey itself became a spectacle. Villagers stopped their work to watch the monster roll past, whispering about what it could do. Some crossed themselves, others grinned in anticipation. By the time the weapon reached the forward siege lines, the fortress loomed in the distance, its walls tall and unbroken, banners snapping defiantly in the wind. The defenders had cannons of their own, their muzzles glinting like eyes watching for prey. The crossbows' assembly began at dawn. Under the shadow of enemy watchtowers, carpenters and engineers worked with furious precision. Each creak of timber, each hammer strike, seemed impossibly loud in the tense morning air. When the giant was finally ready, it stood like a siege god among men. Its bowstring was drawn back for the first shot, the great iron bolt slid into place. Orders were given to target a section of the curtain wall near a corner bastion, a spot where the defenders had already patched earlier cannon damage. If the crossbow could widen that breach, the infantry could storm through before nightfall. The release command was shouted. The thwung was followed by a distant crack that echoed over the field. The bolt slammed into the wall with such force that even the defenders flinched. Dust and debris exploded outward, and when the air cleared, the impact site was a jagged wound in the stone, cracks racing up and down like veins. A cheer went up from the siege lines. The crew reloaded as quickly as the massive mechanism allowed. A second shot tore deeper into the same spot, chunks of masonry tumbling away. Through spyglasses, officers saw defenders scrambling to shore up the breach with timbers and sandbags. But the defenders answered. Cannon fire roared from the ramparts, and one ball smashed into the earth just yards from the crossbow's frame. Splinters and dirt showered the crew, and the commander barked for shields to be raised. Reloading slowed under the constant thunder of incoming fire. One bolt jammed in the track, costing precious minutes to clear. Still, the weapon continued its grim work. By midday, the targeted section of wall sagged dangerously. The crossbow's bolts, each like a battering ram in flight, had done what weeks of smaller artillery might have struggled to achieve. Under cover of its fire, sappers advanced, their picks and hammers striking the weakened stone. Then came the turning point. A defender's lucky shot struck near the crossbow's bow arm, sending a shock through the frame. The weapon shuddered, and the bowstring frayed further at its worn edge. The engineer inspected it in a crouch, weighing the risk of another shot against the chance of catastrophic failure. After a brief, tense exchange with the commander, the decision was made: one more bolt, aimed to finish the breach. The crew worked in silence, every movement deliberate. The weapon loosed its final shot of the day, the bolt striking home with a sound like a tree splitting in a storm. The wall gave way, collapsing in a cloud of dust and screams. The infantry surged forward, their banners rising above the smoke. The defenders, overwhelmed by the sudden breach, began to fall back into the inner courtyard. Victory was not yet certain, but the giant crossbow had delivered its promise. It had torn open the gates of an enemy's pride. Yet, in the fading light, as the weapon stood among the wreckage it had made, the engineer's gaze lingered on the frayed bowstring, the warped track, and the deep scars in the frame. The giant had proved itself, but at a cost that whispered of its own mortality. The victory at the border fortress cemented the giant crossbow's place in the city's legend. Word of its performance spread like wildfire through taverns and marketplaces. Soldiers boasted of serving alongside it, merchants told embellished tales to travelers, and the ruling council paraded it in celebratory processions. For a brief moment, it seemed the weapon had earned a permanent place in the arsenal of war. Other states took notice. Envoys from rival cities arrived under the guise of diplomacy, but lingered suspiciously near the weapon's storage yard. Sketches appeared in foreign workshops, and there were rumors of engineers attempting their own scaled-up designs. The arms race, once defined by cannon calibers, now included whispers of these colossal mechanical bows. Yet beneath the celebrations, cracks were forming, not in stone walls this time, but in the weapon's relevance. Cannons, though temperamental, were evolving rapidly. New casting techniques allowed for stronger barrels, reducing the risk of explosion. Iron shot became more uniform, increasing accuracy. Most importantly, gunpowder was becoming cheaper and more readily available, making artillery a more practical choice for long campaigns. The giant crossbow, by contrast, was costly to maintain. Its steel bow arms required regular inspection for fatigue. The thick, braided bowstring wore down faster than anyone liked, especially after the punishing siege. Replacing it meant weeks of preparation and the work of skilled ropemakers. In the field, every broken part was a logistical nightmare to replace. Commanders also began to see its limitations. While devastating against stationary fortifications, it lacked the destructive versatility of a cannon, which could fire solid shot, explosive shells, or even grape shot against advancing troops. The crossbow's enormous bolts were deadly to structures, but far less effective against dispersed enemy formations. And though it could reload faster than the largest bombards, it could never match the sustained rate of fire of a battery of smaller guns. The weapon saw fewer deployments in the years that followed. Sometimes it was brought out for intimidation, its silhouette towering on the horizon during tense standoffs. Other times, it served as a backup when cannons malfunctioned or powder supplies ran low. But the days of it being the centerpiece of siege strategy were fading. For the engineer who had designed it, the shift was bittersweet. His creation had achieved exactly what it was meant to do. It had shattered a fortress wall and delivered a battlefield victory. But it had also been born in the twilight of its kind, a final flare of mechanical ingenuity before gunpowder dominance closed the chapter on weapons like it. By the turn of the century, the giant crossbow was retired from service. It was stored in an armory corner, covered in dust and cobwebs, its great bowstring removed to prevent warping. Children of the city still whispered about it, daring each other to sneak a look, while older veterans would nod silently at its memory. It had been a marvel, a monster, a symbol, and like so many marvels, it was ultimately outpaced by the relentless march of progress. The giant crossbow never fired another shot in anger. It sat in the dim light of the armory for decades, its frame collecting the quiet dust of disuse, its once polished steel dulled by time. To the few who still visited it, the machine seemed almost like a sleeping beast, one that had roared briefly before the world outpaced it. But its legacy was not measured only in the battles it fought. In military history, it stood as one of the last and most ambitious expressions of pre-gunpowder siege engineering. It represented the culmination of centuries of mechanical warfare, a lineage stretching from the ancient ballista to the medieval springald, refined to a scale and power that earlier ages could only dream of. Engineers of later generations studied its surviving drawings and notes, marveling at the precision of its design. Military scholars debated whether it had been a brilliant transitional weapon or merely an extravagant curiosity. Some argued that it had influenced early artillery carriages, its reinforced frame and elevation mechanisms adapted for mounting cannons. Others saw it as a cautionary tale, a reminder that no weapon, however impressive, can escape obsolescence. Yet in the city that had built it, the giant crossbow remained more than an artifact. It became part of the civic mythology. Artists painted it in heroic murals, showing it silhouetted against stormy skies, bolts flying toward enemy walls. Poets wrote verses comparing its tension bow to the resolve of the city's defenders. Even as its military relevance faded, its symbolic power endured, a testament to ambition, innovation, and the belief that human ingenuity could bend the course of war. In truth, its story echoed a timeless pattern. Every era has its wonder weapons, machines unveiled with the promise of reshaping conflict, only to be surpassed by newer, faster, deadlier inventions. The giant crossbow was no different. It had its moment of glory, and then it became history. Today, fragments of it survive in museums, a splintered section of bow arm, an iron bolt head, a winding gear still marked by the hands that turned it. Visitors pause before them, imagining the noise, the power, the fear it once commanded. And somewhere in the silence between those thoughts lies its true legacy, not as the weapon that ended wars, but as a reminder that in war, as in life, even the mightiest force can be undone by the march of time.